Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. It's time, once again, for another depressing dose of dismal Disney. A little over 2 weeks ago, on October 15th, I released my first ever video about the upcoming MCU movie, The Marvels, in which I projected its final domestic and global box office revenue numbers, as well as how much money Disney and Marvel Studios were either going to earn or lose on the movie. Those projections were based on a number of criteria, including the movie's domestic opening weekend box office revenue that the site Box Office Pro was predicting at the time. Well, guess what? Box Office Pro has revised their predictions for the movie's domestic opening weekend box office, and the numbers did not go up. The numbers went down, which is why I now find it rather humorous that the trades and shill media sites are not publishing any articles about these dismal predicted domestic opening weekend box office numbers for the movie. And just reported the other day in Variety was a very interesting lengthy article about Marvel Studios, including the fact that the director for The Marvels left to work on a different movie before post-production on The Marvels had even been completed. Directed by Nia DaCosta, The Marvels unites Larson's heroine with two superpowered allies, Teyonah Parris's Monica Rambeau, introduced in the 2021 Disney Plus series WandaVision, and Iman Vellani's Kamala Khan, which was first seen in the 2022 series Ms. Marvel. But instead of seamlessly building on the success of Captain Marvel, this movie resulted in 4 weeks of reshoots to bring coherence to a tangled storyline. Then eyebrows were raised again when DaCosta began working on another film while The Marvels was still in post-production. The filmmaker moved to London earlier this year to begin prepping for her Tessa Thompson drama entitled Hedda. Quote, "If you're directing a $250 million movie, it's kind of weird for the director to leave with a few months to go," unquote, says a source familiar with the production. Now, I don't know about you, but if a director abandons a movie before it's complete, that doesn't give me a warm fuzzy feeling that it's going to be a good movie. It instead feels like Nia DaCosta was abandoning ship because of how bad The Marvels probably is. And it doesn't help matters that viewers who haven't seen the Disney Plus shows WandaVision or Ms. Marvel are not going to be familiar with two of the superheroes in this movie. So it's no wonder that the predicted domestic opening weekend box office numbers for The Marvels are dropping. Buried in an October 26th article about two other upcoming movies, Disney's Wish and Ridley Scott's Napoleon, updated predicted domestic opening weekend box office numbers for The Marvels show up way down towards the bottom of the article in a lengthy table. And those numbers now range between $45 million to $67 million, which is a 10% drop from their original predictions of $50 million to $75 million from 2 weeks prior. Ironically, the site is trying to say that it's a drop of 9%, which I assume is to lessen the pain for Disney and Marvel Studios. So what do these lowered predicted domestic opening weekend box office numbers mean for the movie's final domestic and global box office projections? Obviously, those are also going to be lower. The Marvels is not only going to be the 7th superhero movie to premiere in 2023, it's also the 33rd MCU movie. Further, it will also be the 3rd MCU movie to premiere this year following Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, which flopped in theaters, and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which is the only superhero movie to actually break even this year. Currently, there are a total of 4 MCU movies that have domestic opening weekend box office earnings that are less than $67 million. And the one that has the lowest domestic opening weekend box office is 2008's The Incredible Hulk, which only earned around $55.4 million. So if The Marvels fails to earn at least $55.4 million domestically next weekend when it opens in theaters, it will earn the dubious title of having the lowest domestic opening weekend box office for the entire MCU franchise. And the midpoint between the predicted domestic opening weekend box office numbers of $45 million to $67 million is $56 million. So not only is that only $600,000 more than what The Incredible Hulk earned during its opening weekend in 2008, It's also only $1.2 million below what the MCU movie with the second lowest domestic opening weekend box office earned, $57.2 million, which was earned by 2015's Ant-Man. So there is indeed a distinct possibility that The Marvels could end up becoming the MCU movie having the lowest domestic opening weekend box office for all 33 MCU movies. And that's just truly sad and pathetic, but completely explains why the trades and shill media sites don't want to talk about just how bad the movie's predicted domestic opening weekend box office numbers are. The other two MCU movies that earned less than $67 million for their domestic opening weekend box office earnings were 2011's Captain America: The First Avenger and 2011's Thor, which earned $65.7 million and $65.1 million respectively. And what's also important to remember here is that all four of these MCU movies that have the lowest domestic opening weekend box office revenues are also all more than one standard deviation away from the franchise average of roughly $135.3 million, as shown in this histogram chart that separates the current 32 MCU movies based on their domestic opening weekend box office revenues into bins separated by $10 million each. The current standard deviation is $68.7 million, which means that one standard deviation below the franchise average of $135.3 million is around $66.7 million. In other words, 98.6% of the predicted domestic opening weekend box office range for The Marvels is more than one standard deviation away from the franchise average, which just goes to show how horribly bad the interest is in seeing this movie. In stark contrast, the vast majority of the MCU's current 32 movies sit within one standard deviation of the franchise average. And of the three movies whose domestic opening weekend box office that was more than one standard deviation above the franchise average, the highest was 2019's Avengers Endgame, which remains the franchise's highest grossing movie of all time. But there are two more things that we'll take a look at that hugely impacted the performance of the four MCU movies that have the lowest domestic opening weekend box office revenue. Of those four movies, only one of them failed to break even, and that was 2008's The Incredible Hulk. And the two things that further distinguish that movie from the other three are its average weekly drop and its domestic share. The average weekly drop for The Incredible Hulk was 41.11%. While the average weekly drops for the other three movies ranged from a low of 31.76% to a high of 36.83%. And what that means is that the audience for The Incredible Hulk shrank at a much faster rate than for the other three. The domestic share for The Incredible Hulk was 50.76%, while the domestic shares for the other three movies ranged from a low of 34.73% to a high of 47.67%. And that means that The Incredible Hulk, unlike the other three movies, performed worse internationally than it did domestically. So, in spite of the fact that The Incredible Hulk had a production budget of $137.5 million, which was well within the range of $130 million to $150 million that the other three movies had for their production budgets, the combination of a high average weekly drop and high domestic share prevented The Incredible Hulk from being able to break even. And guess what? As this next chart shows, The Marvels has a significantly higher production budget of $274.8 million, which essentially doubled the production budget that The Incredible Hulk had. And that is the fourth highest production budget for all 33 MCU movies to date. And it's also the highest since 2019's Avengers Endgame. And there are 10 MCU movies separating Endgame from The Marvels. With the preliminaries out of the way, let's project what the final domestic box office for The Marvels might be using the revised predicted domestic opening weekend box office range. And to do that, we'll use the MCU's overall average weekly drop of 37.66% as the center point, and one standard deviation above and below as the other points to establish a potential likely range for the movie's final domestic box office. And those other points are at 31.94% to 43.42%. Since the predicted domestic opening weekend box office ranges between $45 million to $67 million, we'll use the range's $56 million midpoint as the basis for the projections. And when we do that, we get the following range of possible final domestic box office revenue for the movie. $129 million at the low end, $148.6 million at the mid-range, and $175.2 million at the upper range. And when I compare these projections with the projections that I made on October 15th that were based on higher predicted domestic opening weekend box office numbers, this range is $14.9 million to $20.3 million lower, which equals to a 10.6% decline. Further, given that the MCU movie that currently has the lowest final domestic box office earnings of $135.3 million was also 2008's The Incredible Hulk, it's entirely possible that The Marvels could become the franchise's lowest domestic earner overall if it doesn't earn at least that much, and my projected range does dip below $135.3 million, though the more likely value is the mid-range projection of $148.6 million. From these projected final domestic box office values, we can calculate a possible range of final global gross box office values for the movie by using a range of possible domestic shares that are one standard deviation above and below the overall MCU's current average domestic share of 41.43%. And with an overall MCU domestic share standard deviation of 6.99%, the range of possible domestic shares that we'll use will be from 34.44% to 48.42%. And I'll briefly point out here that yes, the 50.76% domestic share that 2008's The Incredible Hulk had was more than one standard deviation above the overall franchise average. So applying this range of possible domestic shares to The Marvels yields a possible range of final global gross box office revenue that falls between $266.3 million to $508.7 million, which is a 10.3% drop as compared with the projections that I made on October 15th. But since this is a rather wide range, the most likely value might be close to the one calculated based on the MCU's overall average weekly drop and overall average domestic share. And that value might be $358.7 million, which is very low for a movie whose production budget is reported to be $274.8 million. Having projected what the movie's possible final global gross box office numbers might be, we'll estimate a break-even point range by multiplying the movie's $274.8 million production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively, to account for the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. And when we do that, we get an estimated break-even point range of $687 million to $824.4 million, which is, quite a bit higher than the movie's projected final global gross box office range. So yes, The Marvels, thanks to its very low predicted domestic opening weekend box office and its bloated production budget, as well as its likely average weekly drops and domestic share, will more than likely flop at the box office. And based on its estimated break-even point range and projected final global gross box office revenue, The Marvels currently stands to lose somewhere between $325.2 million to $558.1 million in global gross box office revenue. And when we divide that range by 2 to account for the 50% that movie theaters keep from the global gross box office ticket sales for themselves, Disney and Marvel Studios may lose somewhere on the order of $162.6 million to $279 million. Now, while that won't necessarily be enough to unseat The Flash, which is currently the biggest flop for 2023, as I have documented in my Who Will Be the Biggest Flop video series, it may be enough to unseat Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction, which currently sits in second place behind The Flash. I have suspected for many months that The Marvels is more than likely going to flop at the box office, and these falling revenue numbers only tend to confirm that that's exactly what's going to happen. Being a very female-centric movie, it clearly won't appeal that much to those who tend to love superhero movies the most, male audience members within the 18 to 45 demographic. Thus, those pushing woke identity politics and feminist messaging in superhero movies are not only completely out of touch with the public at large, but also with the main consumers of movies such as these. And they also fail to take into account that most countries outside of the US are not as pluralistic. So diversity, inclusion, and feminist messaging geared towards US audiences will be even less popular and draw even smaller audiences in movie markets outside of the US. And given that the movie's director bailed while the movie was still in post-production, yeah, this is going to be a stinker of a movie that is very likely going to flop and be counted among the biggest flops of 2023. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.